you ever been in a large cathedral with arched ceilings and stunning stained glass? Or maybe a temple or some other achingly beautiful place devoted for centuries to prayer? What comes over you? Awe, wonder, reverence, a thick sense of mystery. For some reason, in those spaces, it's like you just feel like you're a spiritual being, like there's something more going on out there than meets the eye. Something similar often happens to people in magnificent outdoor spaces. If you've ever been to the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or the Himalayas, or even taken a long bike ride on the country roads of the Midwest, you might have felt like a hushed reverence, a sense that your big problems are not so big in the grand scheme of things, a sense of wonder, the beauty of it all, and your deep connectedness to the natural world, like it's all somehow breathing and alive, and you're this small piece of a much larger aliveness. Perhaps Genesis tells us why so many humans share this kind of experience. A couple of weeks back we talked about how Genesis isn't the story of God creating everything out of nothing. Rather, it's about God taking the existing chaos, right, the waters and the welter and waste and darkness, dividing it into categories and giving those categories a function. Right? It's the story of him taking the universe from chaos to purpose. A natural follow-up question is, well, what kind of functionality is God giving it? What's it for? Today we'll talk about how the origin stories seem to be written in a way that tells us that the earth is God's temple, and the humans are the priests in the temple, caring for it and mediating God's presence on the earth. God's taking the chaos and he's creating a functional temple to hold his presence. And if the earth is the temple of God, then the humans are the priests in the temple. And it makes sense that we might experience awe and wonder and reverence when we're out in nature, that we inhabit the temple of the Most High God. Now, several clues support this thesis. So first, the geography itself. Gardens were often situated next to sacred spaces in the ancient world, like the Garden of Eden planted by Yahweh. And Walton tells us that the imagery of fertile waters flowing from the presence of the deity to bring abundance to the earth, it's a well-known image. And we see that reflected in the 4 rivers flowing out from the Garden of Eden. Genesis 2:10 says, "A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters." Throughout Scripture, we find rivers flowing out from God's temple. We see this in the prophet Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel 37, and we see this in Psalm 46:4, as well as in John's Revelation. Second, the artifacts used in the tabernacle of Moses are reflected in Genesis chapter 2. Dr. Walton contends that Exodus 25-40 is actually the companion narrative for the creation story, with parallels between Yahweh and Moses inspecting the various aspects of the garden or tabernacle respectively, and giving their blessing and their approval for each phase. Gold and precious stones, bdellium, lapis lazuli, are both found in the garden, which are later important in the building of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. Additionally, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil bears some comparison to the Ark of the Covenant. Right? The ark was made of wood, and both the ark and the tree brought death. The ark by touching it, and the tree by eating of it. Third, there's grand architectural imagery used throughout the Hebrew Bible to describe creation, as if the authors envision the natural world as an enormous and sacred earthly temple. It speaks of the foundations of the earth about a dozen times. A couple of examples of that include Psalm 18:15, where the psalmist says, "The valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare at your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils." Or in Zechariah 12:1-2, "The Lord, who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundation of the earth, and who forms the human spirit within a person, declares, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding people reeling." On top of the foundation would be the pillars of the earth and the heavens. So examples of the pillars are from Job 9:6. It says, "He shakes the earth from its place and he makes its pillars tremble." Or Psalm 75:3, "When the earth and all its people quake, it is I who hold its pillars firm." In the ancient imagination, the foundations and pillars hold up the floodgates of heaven. If rain comes down from the heavens, there must be water up there. And if it doesn't rain all the time, then something must hold the water back. And that something was the floodgates, and they're like the windows of the temple. And it was thought the opening in the floodgates allowed the flooding of the world to take place, in like the story of Noah. Isaiah also speaks about the floodgates in chapter 24:18. He says, "The floodgates of the heavens are opened, the foundations of the earth shake." And if the world has foundations and pillars and windows, it also has a ceiling. Oftentimes the Old Testament writers describe the heavens being stretched out like a canopy or a tent. Isaiah 40:22 says, "He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in." And of course, this temple has many storehouses. Jeremiah 10:13, "When he thunders, the waters in the heavens roar. He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning and the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouses." And there are many more examples of each of these in the scripture, many of which I've listed in your workbook for reference. But the general idea is that in the imagination of the ancient Hebrews, creation itself is thought of as a temple, and it's described using the architectural language of such. So the geography, the artifacts, and the architectural language point to Genesis being a temple narrative. Additionally, the 7-day creation structure provides some additional evidence. So before a temple was considered functional in the ancient world, it first had to be inaugurated. Right? Temple dedication stories were plentiful in the ancient world, and they often describe inauguration rituals as taking 7 days. And after these 7 days of ceremonies, the gods would come and they would take up residence in the temple. John Walton says, "This isn't new theology for the ancient world. It's what all peoples understood about their gods and their temples." The 7-day structure of the Genesis narrative is normative. It suggests to us that the 6 days of creating is a story about a temple that's almost functional. Leon Kass also points out that the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians, they ran their calendars in 7-day cycles, coinciding with the phases of the moon. And he says, among the Babylonians, these days were fast days, days of ill luck, days on which one avoided pleasure and important projects. In contrast, the Hebrew God disassociated the 7th day from the moon cycle and instead centered the calendar around his magnificent creation of the world. Instead of ill luck and fasting and avoidance of pleasure, the Hebrew God redeemed that day and he set it apart. Right? He made it holy with a blessing. So that's part of the picture. But Walton adds a few shades of color. He says that rather than the 7th day simply being like a peaceful reward after hard work, as I think we often read it, the Sabbath is actually the climax of the first creation story. Because deity rests in a temple, and only in a temple. That's why the ancients had temples. It was a place for the presence of the deities to reside. So the climax of the story is when Yahweh Elohim comes and takes up residence. Yahweh's resting tells us that his very presence has moved into the building. The temple is now ready for governing. The temple is now ready for God's ruling and reigning on the earth to begin. See, resting doesn't mean that God takes a break from the ruling and the reigning. He's not sitting on the couch watching Netflix on day 7. In the ancient world, rest constitutes the normal routines and business of life. It's what comes after a crisis. It's the day in and day out work of running a kingdom. Walton says, most of us think of rest as disengagement from the cares and worries and tasks of life. What comes to mind is sleeping in or taking an afternoon nap. But in the ancient world, rest is what results when a crisis has been resolved or when stability has been achieved, when things have settled down. Consequently, normal routines can be established and enjoyed. So for deity, this means that the normal operations of the cosmos can be undertaken. This is more a matter of engagement without obstacles rather than disengagement without responsibilities. So day 7 is what we hope to call people into. Right? When God's presence rests on them, we want them to go about the work of the kingdom. We want them to engage, not disengage. All of these things point to Genesis 1 and 2 being an ancient temple narrative, telling us the earth is a sacred space of the Most High God.